Helmuth Altner was born on May 1, 1928, in Berlin, Germany. He grew up in the Charlottenburg district, a middle-class neighborhood in the western part of the city. His father worked as a civil servant. His mother managed the household. The family was ordinary, neither wealthy nor poor, neither particularly political nor apolitical. They were typical Berliners navigating life under Nazi rule. Altner's childhood occurred entirely under the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933 when Helmuth was 5 years old. The Nazi regime shaped every aspect of his youth. Education emphasized Nazi ideology. Youth organizations were mandatory. Military preparation was normalized. By the time Altner was old enough to understand politics, the only political system he knew was National Socialism. In 1943, at age 15, Altner was conscripted into the Flak program, a compulsory service requiring teenage boys to assist anti-aircraft Flak batteries defending German cities from Allied bombing raids. The program was presented as patriotic duty. In reality, it was Germany's manpower shortage made visible. The Reich was drafting children to man its defenses. Altner served as a Flak helper in Berlin for nearly 2 years, manning anti-aircraft positions during the increasingly devastating Allied bombing raids. He witnessed Berlin's gradual destruction from the air. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, firestorms consuming city blocks, thousands of civilians killed in single raids. In early 1945, as Soviet forces advanced toward Berlin from the east, the Nazi regime made a desperate decision. All available males, regardless of age, would be conscripted into the Volkssturm, people's militia, to defend the capital. This included teenagers like Altner. On April 16, 1945, the Soviet Union launched its final offensive against Berlin. Over 2.5 million Soviet troops, supported by 6,250 tanks and 41,600 artillery pieces, began the assault. Defending Berlin were approximately 45,000 Wehrmacht soldiers, 40,000 Volkssturm militia members, mostly teenagers and old men, and scattered SS units. The outcome was inevitable. Helmuth Altner, age 16, was about to experience the destruction of his city, his country, and everything he had known. April 16th to 20th, 1945. The Soviets arrive. April 16th, 1945. Helmuth Altner was stationed at a Flak position in eastern Berlin when the Soviet offensive began. The bombardment was unlike anything he had experienced. Soviet artillery opened fire along a 175-mile front. The barrage was designed to obliterate German defensive positions before the ground assault. Altner described the sound as continuous thunder, not individual explosions, but a constant roar that made the ground shake and the air vibrate. From his position, Altner could see the eastern horizon light up with muzzle flashes from thousands of Soviet artillery pieces. The night sky turned red-orange from the explosions. The bombardment continued for hours. The Flak battery Altner served with was ordered to redirect fire from anti-aircraft duties to ground support, using the 88mm guns against Soviet tanks and infantry. The 88mm Flak gun was effective against tanks, but using it in a ground role meant the crews were exposed to counter-battery fire. Altner's first experience of ground combat came on April 18th, when Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Berlin. His battery engaged Soviet tanks advancing along a main road. The 88mm guns were effective. Several Soviet T-34 tanks were destroyed at range, but Soviet return fire was overwhelming. Artillery, tank guns, and rocket artillery, Katyushas, targeted the Flak position. The battery took casualties. Men Altner had served with for months were killed by shell fragments or direct hits. The wounded screamed for medics, but medical support was minimal. Most medical personnel and supplies were already overwhelmed by casualties flooding in from the front lines. By April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet forces had broken through the outer defenses and were fighting in Berlin's eastern suburbs. The city was being encircled. The situation was hopeless. But Nazi propaganda continued to promise that relief forces would arrive, that new wonder weapons would turn the tide, that victory was still possible. Altner, at 16, was beginning to understand that the propaganda was lies. The evidence was overwhelming. Soviet forces were advancing, German forces were collapsing, and no relief was coming. But questioning the propaganda openly was dangerous. SS units were executing defeatists and cowards. Even teenagers could be shot or hanged for expressing doubt about final victory. April 21st to 23rd. The city burns. As Soviet forces pushed into Berlin proper, the character of the fighting changed. This was no longer mobile warfare on open terrain. This was urban combat, building by building, room by room. Altner's Flak battery was eventually overrun. The surviving crew members were formed into an improvised infantry unit, given rifles and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, and told to defend a sector of eastern Berlin. Most of the crew had minimal infantry training. They were anti-aircraft specialists being thrown into ground combat they were unprepared for. The improvised unit took position in the ruins of an apartment building. The building had been partially destroyed by bombing and was now being used as a defensive position. Altner's squad, mostly teenagers and a few older Volkssturm men, occupied the upper floors with orders to engage Soviet infantry and tanks attempting to advance down the street. Altner recorded his first close combat experience in his diary. Soviet infantry advancing along the street, German defenders firing from buildings, Soviet tanks providing supporting fire by blasting buildings with their main guns. The noise was deafening. Rifle fire, machine guns, tank cannons, explosions from grenades and artillery. The combat was chaotic. There were no clear front lines. Soviet forces would advance, German defenders would retreat to new positions. Sometimes Soviet forces would bypass pockets of resistance that would continue fighting while surrounded. The fog of war was absolute. No one knew the overall situation, where friendly units were or what the plan was beyond hold this position. Altner witnessed his first deaths in close combat. A Soviet soldier shot while trying to cross the street, falling and not moving. German soldiers, including teenagers younger than Altner, killed by Soviet sniper fire or tank rounds. Bodies left where they fell because retrieving them meant exposing yourself to fire. The smell of the city changed. Burning buildings produced acrid smoke. Decomposing bodies, civilian and military, created a sickly sweet stench. Burst sewage pipes contaminated everything. The smell became so pervasive that Altner wrote it was impossible to escape it. Food and water became scarce. The improvised unit had no regular supply line. They scavenged from abandoned buildings, finding canned goods, stale bread, sometimes nothing. Water was contaminated or unavailable. Dehydration and hunger added to the exhaustion of combat. April 24th to 25th. The noose tightens. By April 24th, Soviet forces had nearly completed the encirclement of Berlin. The city was being squeezed from all directions. The government district, where Hitler's bunker was located, was still in German hands but was steadily shrinking. Altner's unit was forced to retreat repeatedly as Soviet forces advanced. Each retreat meant abandoning positions, sometimes abandoning wounded comrades who couldn't be moved. The wounded were left with whatever morphine was available, with the understanding that Soviet forces would either capture them or they would die from their wounds. The retreats were disorganized. There was no overall coordination. Individual units decided when to fall back based on immediate tactical situation. Sometimes units would find themselves cut off, surrounded by Soviet forces, and have to fight their way out or surrender. Altner witnessed the breakdown of military discipline. Some units continued fighting effectively, led by experienced non-commissioned officers or officers. Other units collapsed. Men threw away weapons and tried to hide in cellars, deserted their posts or shot themselves rather than continue fighting. The SS presence became more threatening. SS units were not fighting Soviet forces. They were patrolling rear areas looking for defeatists. Young men found without weapons were accused of desertion and executed. Bodies hung from lampposts with signs, "I was a coward" or "I betrayed the Führer." The SS was killing more Germans than they were Soviets. Altner recorded witnessing an execution. A soldier, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, found by SS men without his weapon. The soldier explained he had been separated from his unit during a retreat. The SS didn't care. He was accused of desertion, given a summary trial that lasted minutes, and hanged from a streetlight. His body was left hanging as a warning. The psychological impact on Altner was profound. He was fighting Soviet forces who wanted to kill him while simultaneously fearing SS forces who would kill him for not fighting hard enough. The enemy was in front and behind. April 26th to 27th, the city collapses. By late April, Berlin was in chaos. The civilian population, those who hadn't fled or been evacuated, sheltered in cellars and bunkers while the battle raged above them. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were trapped in the city, caught between Soviet forces and German defenders. Altner's unit was pulled back to defend a sector closer to the city center. The retreat meant moving through ruined streets under fire, past burning buildings, over rubble and corpses. The city was unrecognizable. Landmarks were destroyed, streets were impassable, entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. The unit took position in the ruins of another building. By this point, the building's original purpose was unidentifiable. It was just rubble with some walls still standing. The defenders dug in, created firing positions, and waited for the next Soviet assault. The Soviet tactics were methodical. Artillery would bombard a position for hours. Then tanks would advance, using their main guns to blast buildings at point-blank range. Finally, infantry would assault, clearing buildings room by room with grenades, submachine guns, and flamethrowers. German defensive tactics were desperate. Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons were effective against Soviet tanks but required getting within 30 to 60 meters, nearly suicidal range when the tank had infantry support. Teenage soldiers like Altner were expected to crawl close to advancing tanks and fire the Panzerfaust, knowing Soviet infantry would likely kill them before they could retreat. Altner did fire a Panzerfaust at a Soviet tank. He recorded the experience, the weight of the weapon, the fear of exposure, the blast when it fired, the explosion when it hit the tank. He didn't know if he destroyed the tank or just damaged it. He didn't stay to observe, instead running back to cover while Soviet fire chased him. The randomness of survival haunted him. Men next to him were killed while he survived. A shell would land, killing 3 men and leaving the 4th untouched. There was no logic, no skill that guaranteed survival. It was pure chance. April 28th to 29th, the government district. By April 28th, Soviet forces were fighting in the government district. Hitler's bunker, the Führer bunker, was less than a mile from the nearest Soviet positions. The Reich, that was supposed to last 1,000 years, was down to a few square miles. Altner's unit was among those defending the approaches to the government district. The area was a moonscape. Every building damaged or destroyed, rubble filling streets, shell craters everywhere. The defenders occupied the ruins, firing from whatever cover existed. The combat intensity increased. The Soviets knew Hitler was in the bunker somewhere in this district and were pushing hard to capture him. The German defenders, a mixture of Wehrmacht, SS, and Volkssturm, knew they were defending the symbolic heart of the Reich. Altner recorded the surreal nature of the fighting, battling Soviet forces in the ruins of Berlin's grandest buildings. The Reich Chancellery, the Foreign Office, the Interior Ministry, all were battlefields. The monuments to Nazi power were being demolished room by room. The Soviets brought up heavy artillery, guns firing at nearly point-blank range into buildings. The explosions were devastating. Entire sections of buildings would collapse, burying defenders. The dust and smoke made visibility nearly zero. Altner witnessed something that epitomized the madness. SS officers insisting that Hitler youth boys, some as young as 12 or 13, continue fighting. These children, given rifles or Panzerfausts, were sent to engage Soviet tanks and infantry. Many were killed within minutes. Others broke down crying, unable to process what was happening. The SS officers would shoot the ones who refused to fight. The cruelty of sending children to die while the Nazi leadership hid in bunkers crystallized something for Altner. The regime he had been raised to believe in, that had controlled every aspect of his life, was sacrificing children to delay the inevitable for a few more hours. April 30. Hitler's death. April 30th, 1945. Altner's unit was defending a position approximately 1 kilometer from the Führer bunker. The fighting continued without pause. Soviet forces attacking, German forces defending, casualties mounting on both sides. Word spread through the defenders that afternoon. Hitler was dead. The official story was that he had died fighting heroically at the head of his troops. The truth, that he had committed suicide in his bunker, would emerge later. The effect on the defenders varied. Some continued fighting, either believing in the cause or simply having no other option. Others saw Hitler's death as permission to stop fighting, to survive. Small groups began surrendering to Soviet forces, but the SS presence prevented mass surrender. SS units were still executing defeatists. Anyone trying to surrender openly would be shot by SS men before reaching Soviet lines. The only safe surrender was to wait until Soviet forces overran your position, then surrender directly to them without SS observation. Altner recorded that Hitler's death changed nothing about his immediate situation. He was still in a ruined building, still being shot at by Soviet forces, still likely to die in the next hour or day. The Führer's death was abstract, distant, irrelevant to the immediate problem of survival. May 1st, the defense crumbles. May 1st, 1945. The defense of Berlin was collapsing. Pockets of German forces continued fighting, but organized resistance was ending. Soviet forces were mopping up, clearing buildings, accepting surrenders. Altner's unit received orders to fall back again, this time toward the Tiergarten, Berlin's Central Park. The retreat was conducted under fire, through streets completely destroyed. Bodies, German and Soviet, lay everywhere. Wounded men called for help that wasn't coming. The unit reached the Tiergarten to find it had been transformed into a battlefield. The park's trees were shattered stumps. Shell craters filled what had been lawns. The Victory Column, Berlin's iconic monument, was damaged but still standing, a bizarre symbol of persistence amid total destruction. The unit took position in the park's ruins. There was no clear order to defend any particular position. They simply stopped retreating and prepared to fight where they were. Soviet artillery fire continued pounding the area. The explosions threw up dirt and shrapnel constantly. Men dug shallow trenches for minimal protection. No one expected to survive much longer. Altner wrote that by this point, he had stopped feeling fear in the normal sense. The fear had been replaced by numbness, a dissociative state where he observed events as if watching from outside his body. Men around him were killed, and he registered it intellectually but felt no emotional response. This psychological protection mechanism, shutting down emotions to function under extreme stress, was common among soldiers in sustained combat. But for a 16-year-old, the dissociation was particularly profound. Altner was operating on instinct and training, the conscious mind having retreated to some protected space. May 2nd, surrender. May 2nd, 1945. Morning. Word came that General Helmuth Altner, commander of Berlin's defense, had ordered German forces to cease fighting and surrender to Soviet forces. The battle for Berlin was officially over, but the order didn't immediately reach all units. Pockets of German forces continued fighting, either not receiving the order or refusing to obey it. SS units in particular continued fighting. Surrender meant likely execution for war crimes, so they fought to the death. Altner's unit received the surrender order through a runner, a soldier who had made his way through the ruins carrying the message. The unit's commander, an older Volkssturm man who had survived World War I and now was living through the Reich's end, gathered the men and told them, "It's over. Destroy your weapons and surrender to the Soviets. God help us all." The men destroyed their weapons, smashing rifles, dismantling machine guns, breaking Panzerfausts. The destruction of weapons was both practical, preventing Soviet use, and symbolic, acknowledging defeat. Altner broke his rifle by smashing it against rubble. The weapon he had carried for weeks that had kept him alive was rendered useless in seconds. Then he and the surviving members of his unit, perhaps 15 men out of the 40 who had started defending Berlin 2 weeks earlier, made their way towards Soviet lines. The approach was terrifying. They removed helmets, raised hands, walked slowly towards Soviet positions, shouting, "Nicht schießen," don't shoot. They had no way of knowing if Soviet forces would accept their surrender or simply shoot them. Soviet soldiers, looking exhausted and wary, took them prisoner. They were searched for weapons, had personal items confiscated, and were gathered with other prisoners. The Soviets were not gentle, but were not immediately violent. The prisoners were herded toward collection points for processing. Altner's war ended not with a dramatic last stand, but with this. Walking through the ruins of his city, with his hands raised, surrendering to soldiers whose language he didn't speak, uncertain whether he would be shot, imprisoned, or eventually released. The prisoner. Altner and thousands of other German prisoners were held in temporary camps in Berlin's outskirts. The conditions were terrible. No shelter, minimal food, no sanitation. Men died from wounds, disease, or exposure. Soviet treatment of prisoners varied wildly. Some Soviet units treated prisoners relatively humanely, providing basic food and medical care. Others were brutal. Beatings were common, random executions occurred, and sexual violence against any women prisoners was widespread. Altner witnessed and experienced the brutality. Prisoners beaten for minor infractions or for no reason. Food withheld for days. Men dying from untreated wounds. The Soviet soldiers had seen what German forces had done in the Soviet Union. The destruction, the mass killings, the starvation of Soviet POWs. Many sought revenge. But Altner also witnessed unexpected humanity. A Soviet soldier sharing bread with German prisoners, another providing water to wounded Germans, medical personnel treating German casualties alongside Soviet ones. The war had not eliminated all human decency, even among enemies. The interrogations were frightening. Soviet intelligence wanted to identify SS members, Nazi officials, and war criminals. Being identified as SS meant likely execution. Even being identified as a strong Nazi supporter meant harsh treatment and possible years in Soviet labor camps. Altner's age helped him. At 16, he was clearly not a senior Nazi official or war criminal. He had been a Flak helper and then a conscripted Volkssturm member, essentially a child soldier. The interrogators were more interested in older prisoners who might have been responsible for atrocities. After several weeks in prisoner camps, Altner was released. The Soviets didn't want to feed and guard tens of thousands of teenage prisoners indefinitely. Those determined not to be war criminals or significant Nazis were gradually released. The return. Altner returned to Berlin, or what remained of it, in late May 1945. The city was unrecognizable. An estimated 70% of Berlin's buildings were damaged or destroyed. Entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist, just rubble fields where apartment blocks had stood. The population had plummeted from 4.3 million before the battle to perhaps 2.8 million. The rest dead, fled, or imprisoned. The infrastructure was destroyed. No electricity, no gas, no functioning water system, no public transportation. The city that had been one of Europe's most modern was reduced to pre-industrial conditions. Altner made his way to Charlottenburg, to the neighborhood where his family had lived. The building was partially destroyed. One side had collapsed from bomb or shell damage. He climbed through the ruins to what had been his family's apartment. His family was gone. Whether they had fled before the battle, been killed during it, or evacuated afterward, Altner didn't know. The apartment was looted. Anything of value had been taken by Soviet soldiers or desperate Berliners scavenging for supplies. Altner was 17 years old, alone in a destroyed city with no idea if his parents or siblings were alive, no home, no food, no prospects. The Reich that had structured his entire life no longer existed. The future was completely uncertain. The aftermath. The immediate post-war period in Berlin was brutal. Food was scarce. Ration systems were chaotic and inadequate. Many Berliners were on starvation diets, surviving on 600 to 800 calories per day when 2,000 plus were needed. Diseases spread: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Medical care was minimal. The Soviet occupation was harsh. Curfews were strictly enforced. Random arrests were common. Anyone suspected of being a Nazi official, SS member, or troublemaker could be taken. Women faced constant threat of sexual violence from Soviet soldiers. The occupation forces treated Germans not as defeated enemies deserving mercy, but as perpetrators deserving punishment. Altner survived through luck and adaptation. He found work clearing rubble, the massive job of removing demolished buildings to make streets passable. The work was brutal, backbreaking physical labor for minimal pay, usually in food rather than currency, but it kept him alive. He also searched for his family. He made inquiries, checked refugee lists, visited camps where displaced persons gathered. Eventually, he learned that his mother and younger sister had survived. They had fled Berlin before the final battle and were in Western Germany. His father's fate was unknown for months before Altner learned he had died during the battle, likely killed by Soviet artillery. The psychological impact of what Altner had experienced manifested gradually. Nightmares were constant. Dreams of combat, of bodies, of SS executions, of collapse and chaos. Loud noises triggered panic reactions. He struggled to connect emotionally with others. The dissociation that had protected him during combat had become a barrier to normal human interaction. But Altner also possessed something valuable: his diary. Throughout the battle for Berlin, despite the chaos and danger, he had kept notes. Small scraps of paper, observations scribbled in margins of documents, memories recorded when he had moments of safety. These notes had survived, hidden in his clothing throughout his imprisonment and release. The diary becomes a book. In the late 1940s, Altner began writing a full account of his experiences based on his notes. The process was difficult. Reliving the trauma triggered psychological reactions. But he felt compelled to record what he had witnessed. The resulting manuscript was titled Totentanz Berlin, Berlin Dance of Death. It was a day-by-day account of the battle from a teenage soldier's perspective, detailed, honest, and deeply disturbing. Finding a publisher was difficult. In post-war Germany, there was limited appetite for accounts of the Reich's final days. Many Germans wanted to forget, to move forward, to not be reminded of the defeat and destruction. Publishers worried that a book about Berlin's fall wouldn't find readers. But in 1953, 8 years after the battle, Totentanz Berlin was published by a small German press. The book made minimal impact initially. A few reviews, modest sales, quickly forgotten. What distinguished Altner's account was its honesty. He didn't glorify the German defense or present it as heroic. He described it accurately: a brutal, hopeless battle fought by conscripts and children at the orders of a regime that was sacrificing them to delay the inevitable by days. He documented the SS atrocities against German civilians and soldiers. He recorded the chaos and breakdown of military order. He described the fear, the exhaustion, the gradual psychological destruction of being in sustained combat. And he provided the perspective rarely captured: a German teenager experiencing his country's apocalypse. Decades of silence. After publishing his book, Altner largely withdrew from public attention. He worked various jobs: clerical work, teaching, eventually working in local government administration. He married, had children, built a normal life in post-war West Germany. He rarely spoke about his experiences. His family knew he had been in Berlin during the battle, but didn't know the details. He didn't discuss the war with his children. Like many German veterans, the memories were too painful and the subject too fraught with guilt and shame. The Cold War shaped how Germans viewed their past. In West Germany, there was a process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, acknowledging Nazi crimes while distinguishing between Nazi leadership and ordinary Germans. In East Germany, the communist government presented a different narrative: that East Germans had been liberated by the Soviet Union from fascism. Altner's account fit uncomfortably in both narratives. He had fought for the Nazi regime, but as a conscripted child. He had experienced Soviet occupation both as a defeated enemy and as a victim of harsh treatment. His story was complicated in ways that neither Cold War narrative accommodated easily. Rediscovery. In the 1990s, after German reunification, there was renewed interest in first-hand accounts of World War II's final days. Historians and publishers sought out veterans who could provide detailed accounts of the Reich's collapse. Totentanz Berlin was rediscovered. New editions were published, this time finding larger audiences. Readers were struck by the account's detail and honesty. Altner had captured the chaos and brutality of Berlin's final days in ways that official histories couldn't match. Military historians recognized the book's value. It provided ground-level perspective on urban combat, showed how teenage soldiers functioned or didn't function in extreme conditions, and documented the complete breakdown of military organization in the Reich's final days. Altner gave occasional interviews in his later years, though he remained reluctant to discuss his experiences in detail. He emphasized that he had been a child thrown into circumstances beyond his control, that he had done what was necessary to survive, and that he felt no pride in having defended the Nazi regime, only relief at having survived. He died on August 23, 2011, at age 83. His obituaries noted his authorship of Totentanz Berlin and his service as a teenage soldier in the Battle for Berlin. But they also noted his post-war life, his career in civil service, his family, his contributions to his community. Helmuth Altner was more than a teenage soldier. He was a man who survived trauma and built a meaningful life despite it. The lessons of Altner's account. Totentanz Berlin remains valuable for multiple reasons. The child soldier perspective. Altner's account shows what happens when regimes draft children to fight their wars. The psychological damage, the moral corruption of sending children into combat, the long-term consequences, all are documented in detail. The reality of fanaticism's end. The Nazi regime's final days are often portrayed as either heroic last stand or pathetic collapse. Altner's account shows it was both and neither. It was chaos, cruelty, and the regime's willingness to sacrifice everyone, including children, to extend its existence by days. Urban combat documentation. The Battle for Berlin was the largest urban battle in history to that point. Altner's ground-level account provides details that complement strategic histories, showing what urban combat actually looked like from a foxhole in the ruins. The complexity of guilt and victimhood. Altner's status is complicated. He fought for an evil regime, but was a conscripted child. He experienced trauma and victimization, but also participated in defending Nazi Germany. His account forces engagement with complex questions about responsibility, guilt, and the grey areas of history. The long shadow of war. Altner's post-war struggles, psychological trauma, difficulty connecting emotionally, decades of silence about his experiences show that war's damage extends far beyond physical casualties. Young people drafted into war carry those experiences for life. Conclusion. The boy who witnessed the end. Helmuth Altner was 16 years old when Berlin fell. He experienced the apocalyptic end of the Nazi regime from a unique perspective. Old enough to understand what was happening, but young enough to have had no voice in the decisions that led to it. He witnessed a city destroyed, a regime collapsed, a society disintegrated. He saw humans at their worst. SS men executing teenagers, soldiers brutalizing civilians, occupiers taking revenge. The complete breakdown of civilization that occurs when war strips away all normal social restraints. He also witnessed humans at their best. Soldiers sharing last rations with comrades, medics treating enemy wounded, civilians helping strangers survive. Small acts of kindness in the midst of hell. He survived through a combination of luck, youth, and the basic human drive to continue living even when death seems inevitable. And he did something important. He recorded what he witnessed, creating a document that preserves the experience of Berlin's final days from a perspective that could easily have been lost. Totentanz Berlin stands as a testament to the consequences of totalitarianism, militarism, and the willingness of regimes to sacrifice the young. It shows what happens when governments draft children to defend ideologies those children had no role in creating. It documents the price paid by the powerless for decisions made by the powerful. Helmuth Altner's war lasted 2 weeks in April-May 1945, but the psychological wounds lasted his entire life. The 16-year-old who defended Berlin in ruins was forever changed by those weeks, shaped by violence, loss, and the complete destruction of the world he had known. His account ensures that we remember, not just the strategic facts of Berlin's fall, but the human experience of living through apocalypse. One teenage boy in the ruins of his city, witnessing the end of a regime that had consumed his childhood and nearly consumed his life. May we remember him, and through him, all those, on all sides, in all wars, who were children forced to fight adults' wars and carry the burden of those experiences forever.